I first started listening to the Magnus Archives about a year ago, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. TMA is a very special kind of horror. It's vast and visceral, with an expansive world and a fabulous cast, but most of all, it is truly delightfully horrifying. So, in honor of its sequel, The Magnus Protocol, bringing attention back to this podcast, I thought I'd do a video on possibly my all-time favorite piece of horror. Hey everyone, I'm Ghost, your host with the most, and today, let's talk about the horror of the Magnus Archives. We open on Jonathan Sims, the brand new head archivist at the Magnus Institute, London, an institution dedicated to the study and recording of paranormal activity. He has been promoted to the position after the previous archivist, one Gertrude Robinson, disappeared and left the archives a complete mess. John is quite frustrated with her lack of organization. Papers are misfiled, the place is more dust than office, and worst of all, the statements, collected records and stories tracing back over a century, are a disaster. As his first priority, John sets to digitizing as many of them as he can, trying to get this place back into what he would consider suitable working order. This, unbeknownst to him, is the beginning of the end. A typical episode is structured like this. John will introduce the statement and provide a short overview of its contents. For example, the second episode starts with
Statement of Joshua Gillespie regarding his time in possession of an apparently empty wooden casket. Original statement given November 22nd, 1998. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins.
The bulk of the episode is then dedicated to the statement giver's experience. In this case, Joshua runs into a stranger who offers him money to help him out with something. The man isn't specific. He says okay, because he could use a little cash. Joshua is promptly delivered a giant wooden coffin with "Do not open" scrawled on the front. At first, he assumes it's drugs or something and just rolls with it. And then the coffin begins to moan and screech when it rains, and he notices something inside is trying to scratch its way out. He spends almost 2 years using it as a coffee table in his living room. The scratching never stops. After a statement finishes, John and his assistants will follow up on whatever information they can find about the statement itself, and whatever happened to the statement giver after they came in. Needless to say, the post-statements do not usually paint a nice picture. John himself doesn't believe in the supernatural. Or maybe he doesn't let himself is a more accurate statement. Throughout Season 1, he uses every opportunity to discredit a statement, blaming the experiences on head trauma or drugs or mental illness. In a few cases, directly to their faces. Even as he watches the statements corrupt his computer, forcing him to use the Institute's old collection of tape recorders. Even as the same names and faces begin to pop up, again and again, through all sorts of unrelated stories. Even as the monsters begin to encroach on him, too. The Magnus Archives is an experience best gone into blind. Going in, the less you know, the better. Seriously. I know you horror people. I know what you're doing. I'm going to keep away from any major late season spoilers in this video, but I will be going over some of the ending stuff from Season 1. Even if you think you already know what's going on here, it's not over until episode 200, and the show will keep throwing new things at you until the very end. Listeners beware. And for all of you who give this podcast a chance because of this review, I would recommend keeping off all social media tags about the show until you've completed it. I am dead serious. If anything I've said so far is even vaguely interesting, go watch it. Also, I'd like to put in a warning for discussion of general body horror like trypophobia and rot. I'll give you a few seconds to back off if you don't want to listen to me talk about that stuff. You gone? Good. Let's get into it. TMA's main cast is generally defined by whatever fool managed to get themselves hired in the archives this week. For Season 1, that's John, his boss Elias, and his 3 assistants, Tim, Sasha, and Martin. It has its collection of background players as well. These are usually people who crop up again in actual statements, be them human or monster. Sometimes it's a name. Gerard Key, for example, is one of the first notable constant presences. He's frequently named, often described, as his goth aesthetic and collection of eyeball tattoos make him memorable enough to most anyone that he's not easily missed. Jerry is one of the most blatant of these, but sometimes we're left with a single trait or theme. Men in ill-fitting suits lurking about the site of a disastrous plague. A thing just behind the door, with every bone in its body seemingly pooled in its hands. And skeptic though he is, John is drawn to it with a ravenous curiosity, and we as the viewers fall in with him. The events of TMA are presented to the audience through the lens of the tapes. In Season 1, we can occasionally catch interactions between John and his co-workers. At the beginning, it is usually an accident. But as the show progresses, we get more glimpses into the world outside his office. He starts to carry the recorders with him around the time that things start to come after him, at the insistence that he won't be another goddamn mystery. After all, there are a lot of gaps in the knowledge that John, and by extension we, have access to. Surely the truth has to be there somewhere, buried in the stacks of clutter, spread between hundreds of old documents. But the task of finding it seems so impossible. He can see the edges of it, of course, and that only makes it more frustrating. Nobody will give him a straight answer, so he throws himself in deeper to try and pull one out. Hindsight is 20/20, and the sheer level of foreshadowing the Magnus Archives managed to sew in that I only noticed on re-listen is astounding. Season 1 is a lot of setup. It's the least story-driven of the 5, and is mostly one-off stories that occasionally have reoccurring characters. It generally feels much more casual than the rest of the podcast. As much as a show like this can, I mean. I went through it over the course of a few months, and still go back to it for low-stakes content, but I listened through seasons 2 to 5 in like a month and a half. It was a problem. Every season after that ramps up the involvement another notch. As time marches on, John goes from reading the statements to participating in them more and more often. The post and pre-statement talks get longer as he and his assistants try to scrape by. On the foreshadowing point, this is where a lot of the core concepts are established for later seasons to play with. Creatures, locations, names, etc. Sometimes their appearances will just be in the background, but if it's important enough, John himself will usually remind the audience, making note of people like Gerard Key showing up in a statement. Usually a recurring character or monster will have a strong motif or visual description related to him, so when he misses their presence, you as a listener can catch it and feel like you're pulling back the mystery with him. It becomes harder and harder for John's rationalizations to seem even barely reasonable, and the oddities keep piling up. Why will some statements only record on tape recorder? What happened to Gertrude Robinson, and how much did she know? And what are these things skulking around in the dark? Enter Jane Prentice. Jane is a shambling husk, more worm than woman. She hears them singing to her. She is holes and worms and visceral descriptions of squirming rot. Martin encounters her first, and her worms follow him back to the Institute, where they gradually build up until they burst through the walls. They try to squirm into their flesh and make a new home for themselves inside of the staff's warm skin. It is deeply disgusting. Something that makes this experience significantly more tense is that the Magnus Archives does not pull its punches. At any time, these characters could be severely injured, hospitalized, killed, anything. Anyone. Even though you'd think John would be somewhat protected because of his status as the main character, the fact that he can't die is almost worse, because they sure find creative ways to make him wish he could. It very impressively manages to create a world of vast, horrendous monsters that feel huge and impossible, and simultaneously make you believe that these things could come for them at any time. And they do. Oh, they do. Prentice's worms nearly eat John alive. The attack leaves everyone damaged, and John in particular has his mental health nosedive off a cliff as all that nice protective denial goes out the window and he becomes a paranoid mess. Now that he's looking, he can't stop, because the world has started looking back. The rest of his podcast is to plunge into these depths, both fighting every second and starving for more, to someday finally understand. Maybe if he does, he'll finally be able to feel safe again. The Magnus Archive's horror feels insidious. A line that stuck with me was the description of this sense of creeping, ever-present rot and decay. Descriptions of these creatures are often visceral and unsettling, particularly the ones that deal in mold and flesh and skin. In the statement Jane gave before she became what she is now, she says,
I itch all the time, deep beneath my skin where the bone sits, enshrined in flesh, I feel it. Something, not moving, but that wants to move, wants to be free. It itches, and I don't think I want it. I don't know what to do.
She continues,
There is a wasp's nest in my attic. A fat, sprawling thing that crouches in the shadowed corner. It thrums with life and malice. I could sit there for hours watching the swirls of pulp and paper on its surface. I have done. It is not the patterns that enthrall me. I'm not one of those fools chasing fractals, no. It's what sings behind them. Sings that I am beautiful. Sings that I am a home. That I can be fully consumed by what loves me.
there is a mania quite often to these people that speak of the horrors. But for some, it almost seems like a religious experience. They worship the things that hide in the dark, and only then do you realize that they are toying with their victims. This is amusing to them, like a cat playing with its food. With the sheer quantity of those who go missing right after telling their story, you get the sense that they were only left to escape the first time around so that they could be afraid. So that when the things came back, it would be so much worse. Some survive. Joshua, the man with the coffin, did. Those left behind keep that mark with them forever, though. The show makes that crystal clear. The physical scars from what these things have done may fade, but their minds will always remember. Some rot is rooted too deep to pick out. Thanks for watching. For all of you who've seen the podcast, do you have a favorite episode? Mine's from Season 5, Episode 172, Strung Out. I'm interested to hear what you think. Anyway, that's all I've got. So, maybe give the show a shot if you got the time. Thanks for watching. And good night.